My name is Maya, 32 years old, and somehow still healing from the wounds my husband and his family inflicted. As the founder of a highly successful logistics technology company specializing in supply chains for Black-owned beauty brands, I thought I had built a secure and beautiful life. But I was terribly wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been drained financially and emotionally by the people you called family, only to have them leave you for dead. You are going to want to hear exactly how I rose from a wheelchair to orchestrate the absolute destruction of the people who tried to bury me. The silence in my expansive Atlanta estate was deafening. I sat trapped in my wheelchair, my body feeling like it was made of lead and broken glass. Every joint ached with a deep, piercing agony that had become my constant companion over the past 3 months. My hands trembled as they rested on the thin blanket covering my lap. Just 72 hours ago, I had received a diagnosis that tore my world apart. Late-stage lymphoma, they had said. A death sentence handed down in a sterile hospital room while the man I loved held my hand and cried. But the tears he shed in that clinic were nothing but a calculated performance. Right now, there were no tears. There was only the harsh metallic sound of a zipper closing. Dayon, my husband of 4 years, the man whose law school tuition I had paid in full with my own sweat and tears, was standing in our master bedroom, violently shoving his custom-tailored suits into a designer duffel bag. He moved with a cold, frantic energy, refusing to make eye contact with me. I watched him from the hallway, my breathing shallow, my heart pounding against my bruised ribs. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand an explanation. But the extreme fatigue that had been steadily ravaging my body left me entirely mute. I could only stare in disbelief as the life I had built piece by piece was dismantled right in front of my eyes. Standing beside him, looking utterly unbothered, was his mother, Shirley. She adjusted the vibrant silk scarf draped elegantly around her neck. It was a vintage scarf I had sourced and bought for her as a Mother's Day gift, an attempt to buy the approval of a woman who had despised me from the moment we met. Shirley had always carried herself with the haughty arrogance of a mega-church choir director, looking down her nose at anyone who did not meet her hypocritical standards of righteousness. Today she wore her judgment like a crown. She smoothed the expensive fabric, turned her cold eyes toward my wheelchair, and let out a sharp, dismissive sigh. "We are not wasting our time on someone who is about to die," Shirley said, her voice dripping with venom. "My son needs space to heal. He has his whole life ahead of him, Maya. You cannot expect a handsome, vibrant man of God to spend his prime years changing bedpans and watching his wife wither away into nothing. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and it is time for Dayon to step out of this darkness and into the light." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The absolute cruelty of her statement delivered in my own hallway under the roof my money had paid for was staggering. I looked at Dayon desperately, hoping he would defend me, hoping the man who had promised to love me through sickness and in health would silence his mother. Instead, he simply hoisted the heavy duffel bag onto his shoulder. He walked past me close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne. He did not say a word of comfort. He did not offer a final embrace. He simply reached into my open purse, resting on the console table, pulled out my primary black corporate credit card, and slid it into his pocket. "Thanks for understanding, Maya." Dayon muttered, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "I will have my people reach out to coordinate the rest of my things. Take care of yourself." With that, they walked out the front door. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them, sealing me inside a quiet tomb of my own making. I heard the engine of his luxury vehicle, a car registered in my company's name, roar to life. I listened as the tires crunched against the gravel driveway, fading away until there was nothing left but absolute silence. I was alone. I was 32 years old, successful beyond measure in the business world, yet completely bankrupt in my personal life. I had played the role of the strong Black woman to perfection, carrying the weight of my husband and his family on my back, paying their debts, funding their lifestyles, and ignoring the glaring red flags, because I believed that family required sacrifice. Now my reward was a terminal diagnosis and an empty house. Exactly 10 minutes later, the sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the quiet. The sudden noise made me jump, sending a shockwave of pain through my fragile nervous system. I stared at the caller identification screen illuminating the dark console table. It was Dr. Thorne, my lead physician from the oncology center. My hands shook violently as I wheeled myself forward and managed to grasp the device. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my ear. I expected a follow-up call about hospice care or scheduling palliative treatments. I expected pity. "Maya, are you in a safe place right now?" Dr. Thorne asked immediately. Her voice was not calm or soothing. It was tight, urgent, and laced with an unmistakable tremor of panic. "I am home," I whispered, my voice hoarse and raspy from the pseudo-tumors pressing against my vocal cords. "I am alone. My husband just left me." "Listen to me very carefully, Maya." Dr. Thorne said, her words rushing out in an intense stream. "I need you to stay exactly where you are, and do not consume anything in that house. Do not drink the water. Do not eat the food. Do you understand me?" I frowned, confusion cutting through the heavy fog of my depression. "Dr. Thorne, what is going on? Have my lab results changed? The secondary biopsy and advanced toxicology panels just came back from the specialized laboratory in Boston," she explained, taking a deep breath that sounded loud over the receiver. "Maya, you do not have late-stage lymphoma. You do not have cancer at all." The words hung in the air, refusing to compute in my exhausted brain. "What do you mean I do not have cancer? I saw the scans. You showed me the masses." "They are not malignant tumors, Maya. They are severe internal lesions and granulomas caused by acute heavy metal toxicity." Dr. Thorne's voice dropped to a horrifyingly serious register. "Your blood is testing positive for lethal levels of thallium and arsenic. The levels are staggering. They are nearly 40 times the maximum survivable limit. The extreme fatigue, the hair loss, the lesions, the joint failure, these are textbook symptoms of systemic prolonged poisoning. Maya, someone is trying to kill you." The phone nearly slipped from my trembling fingers. Poisoned. The word echoed in my mind, ringing loud and clear like a church bell. I was not dying of a random tragic disease. I was being murdered. But who would want to kill me? The answer arrived before the question fully formed, blooming in my chest with terrifying clarity. "There is something else you need to know," Dr. Thorne continued, her voice pulling me back from the edge of shock. 10 minutes ago, right before I called you, my office administration received an urgent inquiry from your husband. Dion called to request your official certified diagnostic records. He told my staff he needed them immediately to file a claim with your life insurance provider. He was specifically inquiring about the criteria for triggering the $5 million accelerated death benefit on your critical illness policy. He wanted to know how fast the funds could be released once the paperwork was submitted. A cold, sharp realization pierced through the heavy fog in my brain, freezing my tears instantly. The puzzle pieces clicked together with devastating precision. Dion, my charming, supportive husband who had suddenly taken a keen interest in my health over the past 6 months. Dion, who had insisted on taking over all the kitchen duties to reduce my stress. Dion, who brought me a special custom-made immunity-boosting green smoothie every single morning before I left for the corporate office. He would stand there watching me drink every last drop, smiling his perfect, loving smile, telling me how much he wanted me to stay healthy and vibrant. Those smoothies were not boosting my immunity. They were laced with thallium and arsenic. He had been meticulously, patiently feeding me poison, calculating the exact dosage to mimic a natural terminal decline. He wanted the business the $5 million life insurance payout and the freedom to walk away without the messy complications of a divorce. He and Shirley had stood in my hallway mocking my impending death, knowing exactly why my body was failing. Shirley knew. The way she had smiled when she told me I was not taking that watch to the grave. They were entirely complicit in my execution. The profound sorrow that had weighed me down just minutes prior vanished completely. It evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. The deep ache in my joints faded into the background, eclipsed by a burning, incandescent rage. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had secured their generational wealth by burying the strong black woman who had funded their existence. They thought I was going to quietly fade away in this wheelchair while they spent my millions. They miscalculated entirely. Dr. Thorne, I said, my voice no longer a fragile whisper but a solid, terrifying command. I need you to prescribe the counteragents immediately. Tell me exactly what I need to do to survive this. I am sending a trusted private nurse to your estate right now, Dr. Thorne replied, matching my sudden intensity. She will bring the necessary equipment for intensive chelation therapy to flush the heavy metals from your bloodstream. This must be kept strictly off the official hospital records. If whoever did this realizes you know the truth, your life is in immediate physical danger. Send her, I ordered. And Dr. Thorne, thank you. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the sofa. I looked down at my trembling hands, clenching them into tight fists, until the knuckles turned white. The game had just changed. Dion and his hypocritical, blood-sucking family had orchestrated a masterpiece of deception, but they had left me breathing just long enough to discover the truth. I was going to cleanse my blood, rebuild my strength, and execute a plan that would leave them begging for the mercy they had denied me. Section 2, 1,500 words. Less than an hour after Dr. Thorne hung up the phone, a discreet black sedan pulled up the long winding driveway of my estate. A woman in dark medical scrubs stepped out carrying two heavy silver medical cases. She introduced herself simply as Nurse Clara. There were absolutely no pleasantries, no sympathetic glances, and no wasted movements. She operated with military precision, reflecting the extreme urgency of my dire situation. Within a matter of minutes, she had my immaculate living room transformed into a covert medical bay. She hooked a thick intravenous line directly into my arm, pumping a specialized chelating agent straight into my bloodstream. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and agonizingly painful. It felt exactly like liquid fire racing through my veins, aggressively searching out the heavy metals that Dion had so meticulously deposited into my vulnerable body. Every single nerve ending in my body screamed in protest, but I fiercely refused to cry out. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted fresh blood. Tears were a foolish luxury I could no longer afford. Survival mode had fully activated within me, completely shutting down the grieving, heartbroken wife and violently awakening the ruthless, calculating CEO. Clara worked in absolute silence, monitoring my fluctuating vitals, while the lethal toxins were slowly and painfully drawn from my damaged tissues. Dr. Thorne had been absolutely right. If Dion or his wicked mother Shirley got even a slight hint that I was receiving medical treatment, my life would be in immediate physical jeopardy. I had to remain the dying, helpless, pathetic woman they confidently left behind. I instructed Clara to carefully park her car behind the distant pool house, entirely out of sight from the main street, and to only use the hidden service entrance when coming and going. The physical purging process was excruciatingly brutal, but it effectively cleared the thick mental fog that had kept me docile and confused for the last 6 months. My mind, usually sharp enough to run a massive multi-million-dollar logistics empire, began firing on all cylinders once again. I needed a legal mercenary, a vicious fraud attorney who could quietly and systematically dismantle Dion before he even realized what was happening. Ignoring the intense throbbing in my muscles, I wheeled myself over to my home office desk, dragging the heavy intravenous pole right alongside me. I booted up my encrypted corporate laptop. My fingers flew rapidly across the familiar keyboard, typing the specific URL for my secure corporate banking portal. My primary logistics company, Zenith Supply Chain Solutions, held tens of millions in operational capital. I navigated straight to the priority wire transfer screen, fully ready to authorize a massive, unquestionable retainer to the most ruthless divorce and fraud attorney in the entire city of Atlanta. I entered my secure master credentials. I typed in my complex secondary authenticator code. The screen loaded for a brief second before flashing a bright, glaring red banner. Access denied. Account locked. Please contact your internal financial administrator. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart skipping a painful beat. I hit the refresh button. I typed the complex password again. Access denied. The bold red text burned violently into my vision, mocking my desperate attempt at retaliation. It was not just a random technical glitch. It was a deliberate, hostile takeover. A sickening wave of realization washed over my entire body. As that red banner flashed incessantly, the absolute injustice of my current situation crashed down upon me like a heavy steel anvil. I had built this massive empire entirely from scratch. A decade ago, I was a bright-eyed, highly ambitious sophomore at Spelman College holding a full academic scholarship. I had a clear path to success. Then I met Dayon. He was struggling terribly, failing his classes, drowning in insurmountable debt, but he possessed an undeniable magnetic charm that perfectly masked his underlying incompetence. I foolishly bought into the toxic, pervasive myth that a strong black woman must completely uplift her man at all absolute costs. I voluntarily dropped out of Spelman, willingly forfeiting my own prestigious degree to work grueling 18-hour shifts. I drove heavy delivery trucks by day and coded complex logistics software by night. I sacrificed my youth, my precious sleep, and my overall peace of mind to build a thriving company that could fully fund his incredibly expensive law school tuition. I paid for his custom designer suits, his luxury car leases, and the ridiculous overpriced country club memberships he claimed he desperately needed to network with the elite. I endured the relentless, suffocating burden of the black tax lifting up a deeply insecure man and his wildly ungrateful family, who viewed me not as a human being, but as an unlimited human ATM. Every single bead of sweat, every missed meal, every stress-induced migraine had gone directly into creating Zenith supply chain solutions. Now the immense wealth I had built, with my own literal blood, sweat, and tears, was being held hostage by the very parasites who fed on it. They had taken everything I willingly gave, and now they were forcefully taking the rest. I snatched my cell phone from the desk and immediately dialed Marcus, my dedicated private banker, who personally handled my top-tier accounts. The line rang 3 agonizingly long times before he finally answered, his voice incredibly tight and overly formal. Maya, I am so glad you called. I have been frantically trying to reach your corporate office all morning. Marcus? I said, my voice cold, sharp, and dripping with authoritative command. Why exactly am I locked out of my own corporate accounts? I need a substantial wire transfer processed immediately. There was a heavy, uncomfortable pause on the other end of the line. Maya, I cannot authorize any transfers whatsoever. Your corporate accounts, as well as your joint personal accounts with Dion, have been completely frozen. Frozen? By whose authority? I demanded, my knuckles turning white as my grip tightened aggressively on the phone. By the authority of your own internal accounting department, Marcus replied, his tone highly apologetic but rigidly firm. We received an urgent, highly critical fraud alert early this morning. Your chief financial officer flagged a rapid series of highly suspicious offshore transfers initiated directly from your master credentials. Millions of dollars have been systematically moving into untraceable anonymous shell accounts in the Cayman Islands over the last 48 hours. Due to the highly suspicious activity and the sheer unprecedented volume of capital leaving the domestic accounts, your chief financial officer requested an immediate comprehensive freeze to prevent any further hemorrhaging of company assets. The bank had absolutely no choice but to fully comply with the strict federal regulations regarding suspected corporate embezzlement. My breath completely caught in my throat as the devastating reality settled into my bones. My chief financial officer, Malik, Dion's older brother. He was the exact same brother I had graciously hired to manage my sensitive corporate books out of a deeply misguided sense of intense family obligation when he lost his previous corporate job under highly questionable circumstances. I had generously given Malik a highly lucrative six-figure salary and granted him unparalleled, unrestricted access to my secure financial infrastructure simply because Shirley had tearfully begged me to keep the growing wealth strictly in the family. They had entirely weaponized my selfless generosity. They had used my unconditional trust as a deadly weapon to destroy me. Dion was not just trying to quietly cash in on my highly lucrative life insurance policy. The two ruthless brothers were actively orchestrating a massive, perfectly coordinated financial heist right under my nose. They were deliberately framing me for maliciously embezzling my own hard-earned money, transferring it offshore to secret corporate accounts they undoubtedly controlled, and systematically locking me out of my own highly successful company, so I could not effectively defend myself or hire competent legal counsel. They had carefully anticipated my every single potential move, strategically cutting off my vast financial resources, while patiently waiting for the heavy metals to finally stop my beating heart. The multifaceted betrayal was so profoundly deep, so incredibly calculated and vicious, it briefly took my breath away. But the rising wave of panic quickly dissolved into a chilling, absolute lethal focus that sharpened my vision. I thanked Marcus, abruptly, offered absolutely no further explanation, and hung up the phone. I looked down at the dark, sludgy liquid moving steadily through the clear medical tubing into my aching arm, actively pulling Dion's toxic poison from my recovering veins. They had aggressively frozen my corporate accounts. They had deceitfully stolen my money. They had cowardly tried to take my life. But they made one fatal, irreversible error. They completely and utterly underestimated the resilient, brilliant architect of the entire empire. I was no longer a helpless victim. I was a survivor preparing to obliterate every person who had conspired to violently end my beautiful life. Comprehensive report that made my stomach churn with a sickening blend of awe and absolute disgust. The list was extensive, detailing hundreds of fraudulent transactions meticulously hidden beneath layers of fabricated corporate jargon. Malik had not simply locked me out of my accounts to secure the company. He had been quietly and systematically bleeding my empire dry for the past 3 years. I stared at the raw data illuminating my screen. There were dozens of regional logistics partners listed in our accounts payable registry that I did not recognize. Apex Freight Solutions, Vanguard Transit Group, Horizon Logistics. The names sounded legitimate enough to pass a casual internal audit, especially when approved by the chief financial officer himself. But as I ran a deeper diagnostic cross-referencing their corporate tax identification numbers and registered business addresses, the terrifying truth emerged. They were not logistics partners at all. They did not own a single delivery truck, warehouse, or freight container. They were nothing but hollow paper-thin shell companies. Dummy corporations established exclusively to siphon millions of dollars directly from Zenith Supply Chain Solutions. My chest heaved as the intravenous drip continued to push the chelating agents into my arm. The physical pain of the heavy metals leaving my body was entirely overshadowed by the searing agony of this ultimate betrayal. I had hired Malik because Shirley begged me to save her eldest son from financial ruin. I gave him respect, a massive corner office, and an executive salary. I invited him into my home for Sunday dinners. I trusted him implicitly because he was family. He repaid that monumental generosity by constructing a massive automated pipeline that funneled my hard-earned profits straight into these phantom entities. Malik had brilliantly exploited the sheer volume of our daily operations. When your company processes thousands of invoices a week for interstate freight transport, it becomes incredibly easy to slip in a few dozen fake invoices for ghost shipments. A $10,000 transit fee here, a $25,000 warehouse storage fee there. Malik enthusiastically approved every single one of them with his digital signature. I watched the numbers tally up at the bottom of the screen. Over the course of 36 months, my trusted brother-in-law had embezzled just over $8 million. $8 million stolen directly from a successful, Black-owned business that I had built from absolutely nothing. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking, but I desperately needed to know exactly where my money was going. I opened a secondary terminal window and initiated an aggressive trace on the routing numbers associated with the dummy shell companies. I traced the digital footprints across multiple state lines, actively tracking the IP addresses Malik used to register the limited liability companies. My backdoor access allowed me to peer straight through the corporate veils he had so carefully constructed. The money did not sit in those offshore Cayman accounts for long. It was rapidly cycled back into the domestic economy through a highly sophisticated laundering process. The funds were being washed clean and funneled directly into a massive, aggressively expanding luxury real estate portfolio right here in the heart of Georgia. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I pulled the public property deeds linked to the laundered funds. As the high-resolution documents loaded onto my screen, a bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. Every single property from sprawling commercial retail spaces in Buckhead to multi-million-dollar luxury residential estates in Alpharetta was legally deeded under one single name. Dion, my husband. The man who had repeatedly failed the bar exam and constantly complained about the immense pressures of finding suitable employment. He was now one of the wealthiest secret real estate moguls in Atlanta, and he had funded his entire sprawling empire with money stolen directly from my company. The pieces of their sinister conspiracy snapped together with chilling clarity. Dayon and Malik were not just greedy opportunists. They were exceptionally patient, calculating predators who operated with a terrifying level of coordination. They realized early on that my logistics company was generating massive amounts of capital. But instead of supporting me and building our wealth together as a married couple, they hatched a comprehensive plan to slowly drain my resources while simultaneously plotting my physical demise. They assumed that my worsening health, the extreme fatigue and failing joints caused by the daily doses of arsenic and thallium, would prevent me from ever conducting a thorough audit of my own books. They banked entirely on the fact that I would be too weak, too exhausted, and too distracted by my impending death to ever notice the millions of dollars hemorrhaging from my corporate accounts. Their arrogance was absolutely staggering. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect, undetectable crime against a dying woman. They assumed I would quietly pass away in my wheelchair, leaving them to inherit the earth. Once I was dead, Malik would be in the perfect position as chief financial officer to completely cover their tracks and bury the financial discrepancies forever. Meanwhile, Dion would walk away a grieving widow with an $8 million real estate portfolio and a $5 million accelerated life insurance payout. They had weaponized my love, my trust, and my desperate desire to support my family, turning my success into the very instrument of my execution. I sat back in my wheelchair, the glow of the laptop screen casting long shadows across my home office. The intravenous machine hummed quietly beside me, a steady rhythm that matched the newfound clarity settling over my mind. The heavy, suffocating burden of the black tax had never felt so violently real. I had willingly sacrificed my own college education to lift Dion up. I had worked grueling 18-hour shifts to ensure he never had to worry about a single bill. I had hired his disgraced brother to preserve their family dignity. I had given them everything I had, and their gratitude was a slow, agonizing murder. But as I stared at the irrefutable evidence of their staggering fraud, the lingering remnants of my despair evaporated completely. The emotional manipulation they had used to control me shattered into a million pieces. They thought they had trapped me in a frozen financial cage, but they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I was not just a wealthy wife they could easily discard. I was the supreme architect of the very systems they were trying to use against me. I had built the digital walls they were hiding behind, and I knew exactly how to tear them down. I reached out and gently touched the medical tubing connected to my arm. The chelation therapy was working. I could feel a subtle shift in my body, a tiny spark of energy returning to my depleted muscles. The pseudo-tumors pressing against my vocal cords still ached, and my joints were still incredibly stiff, but the overwhelming paralyzing weakness was beginning to recede. Survival was no longer just a desperate hope. It was a mathematical certainty, and with survival came the absolute demand for ruthless, uncompromising justice. I pulled up a secure encrypted text editor on my screen and began compiling a meticulous dossier of every single fraudulent transaction. I captured screenshots of Malik's unauthorized wire transfers, downloaded the IP logs proving he originated the dummy accounts, and saved the property deeds, linking the stolen funds directly to Dion. I was building an ironclad arsenal of evidence that no high-priced defense attorney could ever dismantle. Every keystroke was a silent promise of the destruction I was about to unleash upon them. But I knew I could not simply march into the police station and hand over a flash drive. If I revealed that I was alive, detoxing, and fully aware of their scheme, Dion would panic. A panicked predator is unpredictable and dangerous. He might try to finish the job directly, or worse, he and Malik might instantly liquidate the real estate portfolio and flee the country with my millions before the authorities could freeze their personal assets. To trap them completely to ensure their absolute ruin on a public stage, I had to play their sick game better than they did. I had to give them exactly what they wanted. They wanted Maya, the successful CEO, to die. They wanted the strong black woman who had funded their lavish lifestyles to quietly disappear into the night so they could celebrate their newly stolen wealth. I looked at the security camera feeds monitoring the perimeter of my estate, ensuring I was still entirely alone. A cold, dangerous smile spread across my face. I was going to give them their ultimate wish. I was going to die. I was going to become a ghost, a silent, invisible force, operating from the shadows entirely unbound by the rules of the living. And from that grave, I would reach up and drag them straight down to hell. I picked up the telephone and quickly dialed Dr. Thorne's private cell number. She answered on the very first ring, her voice tight with anticipation. I clearly laid out my realization. I clearly explained the financial freeze, Malik's embezzlement, and Dion's real estate purchases. I told her that my husband and his family were not just waiting for me to die. They had constructed an elaborate financial trap that required my death to execute fully. If I confronted them now, or if I simply vanished, they would immediately liquidate the stolen assets and vanish into the wind. I needed them to stay exactly where they were, paralyzed by their own greed, waiting for the final payout that would never come. I needed to become a ghost, an entity entirely incapable of interfering with their grand design. Dr. Thorne understood me instantly. She knew the medical system inside and out, and she knew exactly how to manipulate it to our advantage. We engineered a highly coordinated catastrophic health crash. Within 2 hours, a private, discreet ambulance arrived at the service entrance of my estate. Nurse Clara expertly prepped me, lowering my blood pressure with safe but effective medications, making me appear pale, clammy, and entirely unresponsive. The paramedics, carefully vetted and bound by strict non-disclosure agreements, arranged by Dr. Thorne, loaded my limp body onto a stretcher. As they wheeled me out of the house I had paid for, I closed my eyes and let my breathing grow shallow. The official medical report clearly stated that I had suddenly suffered a massive, irreversible neurological collapse due to the advanced stage of my presumed lymphoma. According to the charts, my organs were shutting down, and I had slipped into a deep, permanent coma. Dr. Thorne formally transferred me to an exclusive, highly secure palliative care wing at a private facility on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was a place designed for the ultra-wealthy to quietly slip away. The security was absolute. Biometric scanners locked every door, and a dedicated team of private nurses, all personally selected by Dr. Thorne, guarded my suite. Officially, my prognosis was grim. I was given less than a week to live. The hospital administration notified Dion of my critical transfer, updating him on my comatose state. I knew the news would act as a starter pistol for his final phase of greed. He would assume the finish line was in sight. He would believe that his agonizing wait was finally over, that the ultimate prize was securely within his grasp. He had played the long game, feeding me poison drop by drop, and now he was ready to reap the unholy rewards of his sinister labor. Inside my secure suite, the reality was entirely different. The room was spacious, filled with natural light, and completely devoid of the usual beeping hospital machinery. Instead of lying comatose on a ventilator, I was sitting up in a plush armchair, sipping purified water and receiving round-the-clock chelation therapy. Nurse Clara remained by my side, administering the rigorous treatments that were actively pulling the heavy metals from my bone marrow. My strength was returning with a fierce, undeniable momentum. The agonizing joint pain began to recede and the deep, suffocating fatigue melted away, leaving behind a sharp, lethal clarity. To maintain absolute control over the situation, I had one of my most trusted corporate security technicians covertly install hidden cameras and audio feeds directly inside my hospital suite and at the nurse's station outside my door. If Dion or Shirley decided to make a surprise visit to play the role of the grieving family, I needed to be prepared to jump into the hospital bed and feign unconsciousness. But the cameras revealed a much colder, darker truth. I sat in my secure room, a blanket draped over my lap, watching the live security feed on my encrypted tablet. Days passed. The hallway outside my door remained completely empty. Dion never came. Shirley never came. Malik never stopped by to check on the woman who had generously handed him a career. They did not send flowers. They did not send cards. They did not even bother to make an appearance for the sake of the hospital staff. Instead, they called. I listened to the audio recordings of their daily check-ins with the front desk. Dion would call every morning precisely at 9 o'clock. He sounded upbeat, almost cheerful, entirely lacking the somber tone of a husband whose wife was clinging to life. "Yes, this is Dion calling for an update on Maya. Has there been any change in her status? Has her heart stopped yet?" He asked the question with the casual indifference of someone inquiring about a delayed package. There was no tremor in his voice, no hesitation, just a cold, calculating demand for a time of death. Shirley called in the afternoons. I listened as she aggressively interrogated the nurses, demanding to know why my body was taking so long to fail. She complained about the inconvenience of the waiting period, loudly proclaiming that the Lord needed to hurry up and call me home so her son could finally move forward with his blessed life. Hearing their voices stripped of all pretense did not break my heart. It hardened it into pure diamond. Any lingering trace of mercy I might have harbored for the man I married completely vanished. They were monsters feeding on my resources, eagerly anticipating my funeral, so they could dance on my grave. I slowly turned off the audio feed, a chilling, absolute calm settling entirely over my mind. They wanted a dead woman. I was going to give them a resurrected queen armed with a guillotine. With my physical health rapidly improving, it was time to build my arsenal. I could not rely on standard police channels. Dion was a lawyer, albeit a failed one, and Malik was a shrewd accountant. They knew how to hide behind corporate loopholes and manipulate the legal system. I needed professionals who operated at the highest level of federal law enforcement and private intelligence. I needed people who could track the digital ghosts of my stolen money and build a criminal case so airtight that Dion and Malik would never see the outside of a federal penitentiary. From the quiet sanctuary of my hospital room, I used a secure, untraceable satellite phone to contact Marcus, my private banker. I bypassed the frozen corporate accounts and authorized him to access a deeply hidden, untouchable offshore trust fund I had established years ago before I even met Dion. It was my ultimate failsafe, a reserve of capital completely disconnected from Zenith's supply chain solutions. With those funds, I hired Elias Vance, a legendary private investigator renowned in Atlanta for dismantling corrupt corporate empires. Elias was a former intelligence officer who specialized in forensic accounting and digital espionage. I arranged a highly classified secure video conference with him. I sat in my hospital suite looking directly into the camera and laid out the entire conspiracy. I sent him the encrypted files containing Malik's dummy shell companies, the offshore routing numbers, and the luxury real estate deeds registered under Dion's name. Elias did not ask unnecessary questions. He saw the data, recognized the absolute magnitude of the theft, and immediately went to work. His objective was simple, yet incredibly complex in its execution. He was to physically track every single asset, identify every property Dion had purchased, and trace the exact flow of the thallium and arsenic. I needed to know exactly how Dion acquired the poison. I needed the dark web receipts, the encrypted emails, the shipping manifests. I needed the smoking gun that would transform this from a complex financial fraud case into a slam-dunk conviction for attempted premeditated murder. But Elias was only the first half of the equation. Private investigators gather the ammunition, but the federal government pulls the trigger. I reached out to Special Agent Davis, a veteran operative within the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who specialized in high-level financial crimes and corporate embezzlement. Agent Davis had previously consulted with my company on a massive interstate supply chain theft years ago, and we had maintained a strong mutual respect ever since that successful operation. I knew he was relentless, incorruptible, and despised white-collar criminals who preyed on legitimate businesses with absolute impunity. He viewed financial predators as a cancer on society, and I was about to hand him the ultimate malignant tumor. Contacting the FBI while officially declared comatose required extreme delicacy. I coordinated a secure encrypted drop file delivering the preliminary evidence of Malik's wire fraud directly to Agent Davis's private federal server. I included a voice memo, my tone calm and utterly devoid of fear, explaining the poisoning the frozen accounts in the real estate laundering scheme. I told him I was alive, recovering in secret, and ready to hand the FBI the biggest domestic fraud case of the decade. Agent Davis responded within the hour via an encrypted messaging channel. He confirmed receipt of the files and indicated that the sheer volume of the interstate wire transfers Malik had executed triggered immediate federal jurisdiction. The FBI was officially opening a covert, high-priority investigation into Dion and Malik. Agent Davis assured me that a specialized task force was being assembled to quietly monitor all of Dion's incoming and outgoing communications, track his cryptocurrency movements, and freeze his shadow assets the second we sprang the trap. I sat back in my chair looking out the large window of my hospital suite at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The chelating fluid continued its steady life-saving drip into my arm. My body was healing, shedding the poison that was meant to bury me. My mind was sharp, focused entirely on the intricate, beautiful mathematics of absolute vengeance. Dion and his family were currently celebrating in my expansive home, completely unaware that a massive invisible net was rapidly tightening around their throats. They thought they had successfully executed a brilliant, flawless scheme to seize my empire. They had absolutely no idea that the empire was striking back. I was a lethal ghost hovering just out of their immediate sight, systematically placing the invisible dynamite directly under their feet. The trap was set, the federal agents were watching, and the private investigators were hunting. All I had to do was wait patiently in the shadows for them to make their final fatal mistake. I did not have to wait long. The silence of my hospital room was shattered only by the soft hum of the air filtration system as I reached for my secondary encrypted tablet. Long before the heavy metals had begun to destroy my physical body, I had sensed a subtle, inexplicable shift in the atmosphere of my own home. Call it female intuition, or the hyper-vigilant paranoia of a seasoned chief executive officer. But 6 months ago, I had quietly hired a discreet security firm to install a network of microscopic high-definition smart home cameras throughout my estate. They were embedded in the crown molding, hidden inside the intricate ventilation grates, and concealed within the custom light fixtures I had personally selected. Dion had absolutely no idea they existed. I tapped the secure application icon on my screen, entered my biometric passcode, and instantly brought up the live feeds from my house. The crystal-clear resolution beamed directly into my sterile sanctuary, offering a voyeuristic window into the very home I had paid for with my own blood and sweat. I cycled through the exterior cameras first. Everything appeared perfectly normal. The manicured lawns were pristine, and the luxury vehicles I had purchased sat gleaming in the circular driveway. I switched the feed to the interior, tapping the icon for the master bedroom. It was my sacred space decorated in soft creams and rich gold accents, a room I had meticulously designed as a refuge from the crushing demands of my corporate life. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second before stabilizing. My breath caught sharply in my throat, and a sickening wave of revulsion washed over me. Dayon was not alone. He was strolling confidently into our bedroom, laughing loudly, his arm wrapped casually around the waist of a young woman. I zoomed in, enhancing the facial recognition feed on my tablet. The blood roared in my ears as her identity registered. It was Chloe. Chloe was 24 years old, a young woman known throughout Atlanta as the godly, innocent lead soloist of Shirley Massive megachurch choir. She was the picture of pure, untouched virtue, always wearing modest floral dresses and singing hymns with tears streaming down her flawless face every single Sunday. Shirley frequently paraded her around the congregation, loudly praising her pristine morals and deep devotion to the church. Seeing her standing in the center of my master bedroom was a staggering shock, but it was nothing compared to the violent blow that came next. As Chloe turned to place her designer handbag on my custom vanity, the fabric of her coat pulled tightly across her torso. She was undeniably, visibly pregnant. Judging by the distinct roundness of her stomach, she was easily 5 months along. The sheer mathematics of the betrayal hit me like a physical punch to the chest. 5 months. Dayon had been sleeping with this supposedly innocent choir girl in my bed, establishing a brand new family right around the exact same time he began slipping arsenic into my morning smoothies. He was not just trying to steal my hard-earned fortune. He was actively clearing out his current life to make room for his new, younger replacement. He was replacing me with a woman handpicked from his mother-religious inner circle. I watched in absolute disgust as Dion pulled Chloe close, kissing her deeply, right there on the edge of the mattress I had purchased. He rubbed her swelling belly with a sickening display of affection, a look of profound pride plastered across his face. It was a look he had never, not once, given me during our entire decade of marriage. I squeezed the edge of my tablet so hard my knuckles turned white, fighting the sudden violent urge to hurl the device across the hospital room. They were desecrating my home, parading their illicit, treacherous affair in the very place I was supposed to feel safest. But the horror show was far from over. A notification pinged on my screen indicating motion in the formal dining room downstairs. I quickly toggled the camera feed. Shirley had arrived. My mother-in-law strutted into my house as if she possessed the grand deed to the estate, carrying a massive casserole dish and shouting for Dion and Chloe to hurry downstairs. She looked vibrant, celebratory, and entirely devoid of any grief for her supposedly dying daughter-in-law. I activated the high-fidelity audio feed, the ambient sounds of my own dining room filtering directly into my earpiece. Dion and Chloe bounded down the grand staircase, laughing like two careless teenagers. Shirley greeted them with open arms, pulling Chloe into a deep theatrical embrace. They settled around the massive oak dining table, the very table where I had hosted countless Thanksgiving dinners, serving these exact same people who were now plotting my demise. I increased the volume on my tablet, catching every single treacherous syllable that fell from their lips. Shirley reached across the polished wood and placed both of her hands squarely on Chloe's pregnant belly, her face practically glowing with sheer, unadulterated ecstasy. "Praise the Lord," Shirley declared, her voice ringing out with that familiar, booming megachurch cadence. "He is so good to us. He is so incredibly faithful. Look at this beautiful, blessed child growing right here." Chloe giggled softly, leaning into Dion's shoulder as he poured them all generous glasses of my most expensive imported wine. "I just cannot believe how perfectly everything is working out," Chloe murmured, sipping the wine without a single care for the child growing inside her. "It feels like a dream, Miss Shirley. Dion and I have been praying for this exact moment for so long." Shirley waved her hand dismissively, an ugly, triumphant sneer twisting her features. "God always answers the prayers of the righteous, my sweet girl." He saw how my son was suffering. He saw that Dayon was unequally yoked to a woman who refused to understand her proper biblical place in the home. I sat perfectly still in my hospital chair, the chelating fluid dripping steadily into my veins, listening as the woman who had begged me to hire her embezzling son proceeded to assassinate my character. "That Maya," Shirley spat, saying my name like it was a foul curse word, "always working, always traveling, always obsessing over her little logistics company and her bank accounts. A true wife submits to her husband. She nurtures the home, she brings forth life. Shirley stroked Chloe's hand affectionately, continuing her grotesque sermon. God had to intervene. He had to step in and remove that barren, career-obsessed woman from my son's life to make room for a true, fertile, submissive wife. You are the blessing Dion truly deserves, Chloe. You are the mother his children need. The sheer absolute hypocrisy of her statement was suffocating. I had spent tens of thousands of dollars on elite fertility treatments, trying to give Dion a child, enduring agonizing rounds of hormone injections while he secretly complained about the financial cost. He had blamed my demanding career for our inability to conceive, when the truth was that my career was the only thing funding our entire existence. And now Shirley was sitting in my house, eating off my plates, attributing my lethal poisoning to divine intervention. It is a shame about her illness, though, Chloe said, feigning a small, pathetic pout. Do the doctors really say she only has a few days left? Dion scoffed loudly, taking a large gulp of wine. Let us hope so. The hospital administration called this morning. Her organs are completely shutting down. It is irreversible. It is only a matter of time before they pull the plug and we can finally move into the master suite permanently. Shirley raised her glass in a toast, her eyes gleaming with dark, predatory joy. Do not pity her, Chloe. Her sickness is not a tragedy. It is divine punishment. The Lord strikes down the prideful and the arrogant. Maya thought she was better than us because she had money. She thought she could control this family with her wealth. But the Lord is just. He is simply returning the wealth of the wicked into the hands of the righteous. This house, the properties, the company, it all rightfully belongs to Dayon now. God is just clearing the weeds to let the flowers bloom. They clinked their glasses together, the crystal chiming brightly over the audio feed, a sickening soundtrack to their ruthless victory lap. They were toasting to my agonizing death, celebrating the violent theft of my entire life work under the deeply twisted guise of religious entitlement. They viewed my murder not as a horrific crime but as a justified spiritual cleansing. I stared at the screen, watching them laugh and feast in my home, and felt my total absolute vengeance solidify into a freezing point of no return. The perfect trap was fully armed now, permanently. I turned away from the sickening security feed and immediately opened my encrypted communication channel to Agent Davis. The time for passive observation had absolutely ended. We needed to move aggressively to secure the physical evidence of Dion's attempted murder before he decided to dispose of any remaining toxins. Operating from his federal command center, Agent Davis coordinated directly with my digital backdoor access. I granted the FBI's elite cyber division temporary entry into our home network router, allowing them to mirror Dion's personal laptop and mobile devices in real time. Dion was incredibly sloppy. He possessed the arrogance of a man who believed he was the smartest person in every room, completely oblivious to the digital footprints he left scattered across the web. Agent Davis and his team ripped through Dion's browser history with surgical precision. They bypassed his rudimentary VPN software, within minutes delving straight into the dark web marketplaces he frequented. It did not take long to find the smoking gun. Dion had utilized a highly specific, heavily encrypted overseas supplier to procure the lethal cocktail of arsenic and thallium. He thought paying with cryptocurrency would render the transaction entirely untraceable. He was horribly wrong. Agent Davis deployed a sophisticated blockchain forensic tool that systematically unmasked the anonymous wallet addresses. We watched the data populate on my screen, tracing a direct, unbroken line from Dion's personal cryptocurrency account to the offshore poison distributor. The federal agents intercepted the shipping manifests and cross-referenced them with a package delivered to a private postal box Dion rented under a fake name 6 months ago. It perfectly aligned with the exact week my mysterious illness began. The evidence was absolute and irrefutable. Dion had researched tasteless, odorless heavy metals, calculated the lethal dosage required for a woman of my exact weight, and executed the purchase. Agent Davis confirmed over our secure channel that the attempted murder charge was officially locked in. Dion was no longer just a cheating, opportunistic husband. He was a documented, federally pursued assassin. The FBI had everything they needed to put him away for decades, but I was not quite finished with his brother. Malik's financial embezzlement required a different, far more intricate form of destruction. I needed to ensure that every single dime he stole was permanently trapped, completely inaccessible to him or Shirley. Using my secure satellite phone, I contacted Marcus at my private offshore bank. I authorized the immediate release of vast amounts of capital from my untouchable safety net account. This money had never touched Zenith Supply Chain Solutions. It was pure, unadulterated financial power that Malik knew absolutely nothing about. I was preparing to turn his own limitless greed into his absolute and devastating downfall. I instructed my offshore legal team to aggressively investigate the corporate structure of the dummy shell companies Malik had been using to siphon Zenith's profits. Fraudulent limited liability companies rarely exist in a vacuum. They are almost always bundled together and owned by larger anonymous parent holding companies to obscure the paper trail. My legal mercenaries tracked these holding companies to a corporate registry in Delaware. They were poorly capitalized and heavily leveraged, relying entirely on the stolen cash flow from my logistics empire to maintain their operational facades and service the massive debt on Dion's real estate portfolio. With swift, brutal efficiency, I weaponized my offshore capital. I did not just freeze Malik's fake companies. I actively bought the massive commercial debt associated with their parent holding entities. Through a complex series of rapid anonymous corporate acquisitions, my offshore trust effectively swallowed the entire holding structure whole. I executed a hostile, invisible takeover of the very machinery Malik had built to destroy me. By the time the ink dried on the digital contracts, the legal reality was a stroke of absolute poetic justice. Malik was no longer laundering money into secret accounts controlled by him and Dion. He was actively, enthusiastically funneling millions of dollars straight into a corporate vault that I completely and exclusively owned. He was diligently working as my personal unpaid money launderer. Every fraudulent invoice he approved, every ghost shipment he authorized, every single dollar he stole from Zenith was now being deposited directly into my own offshore portfolio. I had successfully reversed the flow of his entire operation without alerting a single alarm or raising any suspicion. The real estate deeds Dion thought he held were now technically collateral owned by my parent corporation. They had spent 3 years building a magnificent, sprawling financial fortress, and I had just silently changed the locks on all the doors to trap them completely inside. The final phase required baiting the trap for the ultimate federal felony. I needed Malik to commit one last undeniable act of wire fraud across state lines to trigger an immediate, inescapable federal indictment. He had to hang himself with his own sheer greed. I contacted the primary domestic bank holding the Zenith corporate accounts. These were the exact same accounts Malik had aggressively frozen to prevent me from fighting back. I bypassed the standard fraud department and connected directly with the senior vice president of commercial banking, utilizing my supreme executive authority and the highly restricted federal clearance codes provided by Agent Davis. I instructed the bank to quietly and partially lift the internal security freeze on the primary operating account. I did not want the account fully restored, which would raise Malik's immediate suspicion and potentially scare him off. Instead, I had the bank simulate a temporary automated system glitch. It created a brief 24-hour window where the outgoing wire transfer limits were magically restored before the system theoretically locked down again. I knew exactly how Malik's greedy mind operated. The moment he received the automated notification that the corporate funds were temporarily accessible, blind panic and incredible avarice would instantly override his usual cautious nature. He would see this simulated glitch as a fleeting, miraculous opportunity to drain the last remaining millions from Zenith before the entire company collapsed under the weight of my impending death. I sat in my hospital room, watching the raw back-end terminal of the banking server, my heart beating with a cold, calculated rhythm. Agent Davis and his cyber task force were monitoring the exact same digital gateway, their federal recording systems primed and ready to capture the definitive crime. The tension in the digital air was incredibly thick. We watched his digital shadow hover over the system. We waited in absolute silence for exactly 3 hours. Then the terminal screen flared bright green. Malik had taken the bait. He had logged into the primary Zenith financial portal using his executive credentials. He was rapidly initiating a massive, unprecedented wire transfer. He was attempting to move $4.5 million in a single sweeping transaction to one of the dummy shell companies he believed he still controlled. He attached a highly fabricated, urgently backdated invoice for international freight logistics to artificially justify the massive outflow of corporate cash. He truly believed he was masterfully executing a brilliant, flawless, entirely victimless crime, assuming the fake documentation would easily pass a standard routine audit once I was gone. He was moving the money from our accounts in Georgia to a banking server in Delaware. It was a textbook, undeniable violation of federal wire fraud statutes. I watched the progress bar on the terminal load as Malik initiated the final authorization sequence. He entered his secondary security token. He verified the dummy routing numbers. He was entirely consumed by the intoxicating thrill of the heist, completely oblivious to the federal crosshairs resting squarely on his forehead. He aggressively clicked the final execution command. The transaction successfully processed. The digital confirmation receipt populated on the screen, cementing his absolute ruin in permanent federal records. He had just voluntarily committed a major documented federal felony. Agent Davis immediately transmitted a single deeply satisfying confirmation message to my secure terminal. We have him completely. The ironclad case was now perfectly complete. Dion was locked in for attempted homicide and purchasing lethal toxins over the dark web. Malik was permanently nailed for massive corporate embezzlement and interstate wire fraud. Shirley and Chloe were happily sitting in my house, oblivious to the fact that their entire blessed existence was funded by a criminal enterprise that had just been completely dismantled by the very woman they were eagerly waiting to bury. I unhooked the intravenous line from my arm, the chelating therapy finally complete. The heavy metals were purged, the digital traps were sprung, and my physical strength was fully restored. I slowly stood up from the hospital chair and walked over to the tall mirror. The pale, fragile victim was entirely gone. Looking back at me was a woman forged in absolute fire, completely ready for war. It was time to rise from the dead march, back into the world they thought they controlled, shatter their entire fragile existence, and aggressively reclaim my stolen kingdom. I turned away from the mirror, the reflection of a newly resurrected queen fading as I picked up my encrypted tablet one final time before packing my things. Every general knows that before launching a full-scale invasion, you must survey the entire battlefield to ensure absolutely no enemy combatants are left hiding in the periphery. Dayon, Malik, and Shirley were already firmly locked in the federal crosshairs, their fates sealed by their own monstrous greed. But the Addams family tree had one more rotten branch, and I needed to ensure it was properly pruned. I opened my social media monitoring tools, running a comprehensive sweep of the digital footprint left by my husband's extended family. That was when I discovered the ultimate grotesque insult. Keisha Dion, younger sister, had officially entered the fray. Keisha had always been a peripheral annoyance during my marriage. She was a professional freeloader, constantly bouncing between failed business ventures and relying entirely on her mother and brothers to fund her lavish lifestyle. She had visited my home exactly twice in the last 5 years, both times to ask for substantial loans that I flatly refused to provide. I had always considered her too lazy to orchestrate any real damage, assuming she was merely a harmless parasite. I was entirely wrong. Keisha was not just a parasite. She was a highly opportunistic, completely ruthless grief grifter. Right there on my screen, dominating the trending pages of my local business network and community forums, was a massive, professionally managed GoFundMe campaign. The banner image was a beautifully filtered black and white photograph of me from a corporate gala adorned with angelic graphics and a prominent, sickening headline. It read, "Help my beloved sister-in-law, rest in peace." The campaign had been active for nearly 2 weeks, perfectly timed to coincide with my transfer to the palliative care wing. I clicked on the campaign details, my blood turning to ice as I watched the embedded video. Keisha was sitting in what looked like a dimly lit sanctuary, wearing a modest black sweater that contrasted sharply with her usual flashy attire. She stared directly into the camera, tears streaming down her face, her chest heaving with theatrical, uncontrollable sobs. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of absolute fabricated devastation. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her voice shaking with manufactured grief, as she addressed the camera. She even recounted entirely fictional stories of our deep sisterly bond, detailing fabricated memories of late-night conversations and shared family holidays that never actually happened. She spoke of how I had supposedly mentored her, framing herself as the devastated protégé left behind. She spoke directly to my friends, my corporate colleagues, and the wider Atlanta business community. She painted a tragic, heartbreaking picture of a family financially ruined by my sudden catastrophic illness. She claimed that my insurance had completely denied coverage for my specialized palliative treatments, leaving her beloved brother Dion drowning in exorbitant medical bills. She begged, literally clasping her hands together in prayer, for donations to cover my end-of-life care and my impending supposedly massive funeral expenses. She leveraged my reputation, exploiting the goodwill I had spent a decade building within the logistics industry to line her own pockets. The sheer audacity of the scam was breathtaking. My corporate accounts were fully funded, my offshore assets were untouched, and my medical care was entirely self-paid through secure channels. Dion had not spent a single dime on my hospitalization. He was too busy buying real estate and impregnating his mistress. Yet Keisha was online weaponizing my impending death to extort money from people who genuinely cared about me. I scrolled down to look at the donation ledger. The numbers were staggering. My corporate partners, local vendors, and even distant acquaintances had poured money into the campaign out of genuine sympathy and respect for my career. The total raised currently stood at an astonishing $150,000. Keisha had successfully orchestrated a massive public fraud, capitalizing on my tragedy with cold, calculating precision. A dark, predatory calm washed over me. I did not feel hurt. I felt a chilling sense of absolute purpose. I immediately opened my secure communication channel and contacted Elias Vance, the brilliant private investigator I had hired with my offshore funds. I did not bother with pleasantries. I sent him the link to the fraudulent campaign and gave him a single explicit directive. I needed to know exactly where every single dollar of that $150,000 was going. I needed the banking routing numbers, the withdrawal history, and the exact digital trail of Keisha's illicit windfall. Elias operated with the speed and efficiency of a ghost. Within 4 hours, my encrypted tablet chimed with an incoming data packet. I opened the file, reviewing the comprehensive financial dossier Elias had compiled. The reality of Keisha's grief was laid bare in black and white bank statements, and it was entirely predictable in its vanity. She was not using the funds to pay phantom medical bills or arrange a beautiful funeral. She was actively liquidating the GoFundMe account to finance the ultimate luxurious celebration of her newly acquired wealth. By tracking her digital footprint and banking activity, Elias had uncovered a massive spending spree. Keisha had transferred over $100,000 into a personal checking account within hours of the funds clearing. I reviewed the itemized receipts, each transaction a glaring testament to her absolute lack of a moral compass. She had not paid a single hospital invoice. Instead, she had walked straight into a high-end designer boutique in Buckhead and dropped $12,000 on a complete set of custom limited edition monogrammed luggage. She needed the luggage for the lavish extended VIP vacation she had booked to Tulum, Mexico. The itinerary Elias intercepted was staggering. Keisha had reserved a massive private oceanfront villa for an entire month. She had prepaid for private chef's exclusive beach club access and premium spa packages. The villa itself featured 5 master suites, an infinity pool, and a dedicated staff trained to cater to her every whim. She was orchestrating a month-long coronation as the newly wealthy socialite of her friend group. She had even arranged a luxury yacht rental for a week-long excursion along the coast, complete with a fully stocked premium bar and a dedicated crew. She was planning to celebrate my death by sipping expensive champagne on the deck of a yacht in the Caribbean, entirely funded by the people who thought they were easing my final days. I clicked through the evidence, my mind working with lethal precision. Keisha had made a fatal error. By utilizing a digital crowdfunding platform and transferring the funds across various electronic banking channels, she had elevated her pathetic scam from a simple local grift into a highly documented, undeniable case of federal wire fraud and charity extortion. She had used the internet to solicit funds under false pretenses, stealing across state lines. It was a massive federal crime, and she had left a paper trail so wide and clear a blind person could follow it. I immediately compiled the GoFundMe records, the bank transfer logs, and the luxury vacation receipts into a single highly encrypted dossier. I forwarded the entire package directly to Special Agent Davis at the FBI. I included a brief clinical note detailing the fraudulent nature of the campaign, explicitly stating that no medical bills existed and that the funds were actively being diverted for a luxury vacation in Mexico. Agent Davis responded within minutes. His message was brief, professional, and dripping with the quiet satisfaction of a federal investigator handed a slam-dunk conviction. The FBI takes charity fraud incredibly seriously, especially when it involves crossing state lines and intentionally exploiting the public trust. Agent Davis confirmed Keisha's actions constituted multiple counts of wire fraud and theft by deception. He assured me his cyber task force was immediately freezing the remaining GoFundMe funds and placing a hard federal lock on Keisha's personal checking accounts. She was completely trapped. She had the designer luggage, the non-refundable first-class tickets to Mexico, and absolutely no access to the money required to pay for any of the exorbitant lifestyle choices she had just made. The yacht company would soon find her credit cards declining. The villa management would cancel her reservation. She would be left holding thousands in designer bags, completely incapable of buying a simple cup of coffee, while federal agents prepared the arrest warrants. My husband had tried to murder me. My brother-in-law had tried to bankrupt me. My mother-in-law had celebrated my demise. And my sister-in-law had tried to profit off my corpse. They were absolute monsters, completely blinded by greed. I slowly zipped my small duffel bag closed, stepping out of my sterile hospital sanctuary forever. It was finally time to return home now. I stepped out of the private palliative care wing, leaving the sterile smell of antiseptic behind me forever. Elias had arranged a secure temporary safe house in downtown Atlanta, a sleek penthouse overlooking the city skyline, where I could safely orchestrate the final act of my vengeance. My physical strength had fully returned, replaced by a fierce, undeniable energy. I was no longer the dying woman confined to a bed. I was the architect of their destruction, watching my enemies blindly walk toward the cliff edge. Dion, however, was growing increasingly impatient. He had grown tired of waiting for my heart to stop beating. He wanted his massive payday, and he wanted it immediately. The millions he anticipated inheriting were tied up in the complex valuation of Zenith Supply Chain Solutions. Probate could take months, even years, and Dion was a man driven by instant gratification. He needed liquid cash to fund his brand new life with Chloe and to cover the spiraling debts Malik had recklessly accrued. Dion decided to bypass the waiting game entirely. He made a desperate, incredibly greedy move that would seal his fate permanently. He reached out to Apex Logistics, my company's most bitter and aggressive corporate rival. Apex had been trying to buy me out for the better part of a decade, and I had flatly rejected every single one of their offers. Dion knew this. He also knew they would jump at the chance to acquire Zenith at a steep discount. He contacted their acquisition team and offered them a fire sale. He proposed selling my entire logistics empire for a quick under-the-table cash payout of $10 million. It was a fraction of what Zenith was actually worth, but to a man who had never earned a single dime of his own $10 million in immediate, untraceable cash was the ultimate prize. To execute this massive corporate sale, while I was still technically breathing, Dion had to navigate a mountain of legal hurdles. He needed absolute executive authority. Since he held no actual power within my company, he decided to simply manufacture it. He drafted a comprehensive, entirely fraudulent power of attorney document. He painstakingly forged my signature, likely copying it from old tax returns or banking statements he had stolen from my home office. He authorized himself as the sole decision-maker for all corporate assets, granting himself the unmitigated power to liquidate my life work. He truly believed his plan was entirely foolproof. In his arrogant, narrow mind, he assumed my imminent death would completely bury the forgery. He figured that once I was in the ground, no one would ever question the paperwork, and the $10 million would already be safely hidden in his private offshore accounts. He prepared the massive corporate transfer documents binding Zenith Supply Chain Solutions over to Apex Logistics and set the wheels of his final betrayal into motion. He was so blinded by the flashing dollar signs that he completely underestimated the loyalty of the people I had hired. Dion could not finalize a corporate acquisition of this magnitude entirely on his own. He needed the official corporate seals, the internal registry codes, and the final administrative clearance. To get those, he had to go through Elena. Elena was my fiercely loyal executive assistant. She had been by my side since the very first day I launched Zenith out of a cramped, windowless rental office. We had built the company together. She knew my voice, she knew my vision, and she knew exactly how I operated. Dion strutted into the Zenith corporate headquarters, acting like he already owned the building. He bypassed the security protocols, walked straight into the executive suite, and dropped the stack of fraudulent acquisition contracts directly onto Elena's desk. He casually informed her that I had supposedly experienced a brief moment of clarity in the hospital and had authorized him to sell the company to alleviate the stress on the family. He demanded she apply the corporate seals and arrange for an immediate notarization of the signatures. He spoke to her with the condescending tone of a king addressing a peasant. Elena did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at the documents, her sharp eyes instantly catching the glaring inconsistencies. She knew for an absolute fact that I would rather burn Zenith to the ground than sell it to Apex Logistics. She took the paperwork, smiled politely at Dion, and told him she would prepare everything for the official signing ceremony the following afternoon. The moment Dion stepped onto the elevator, Elena locked the executive suite. She utilized the highly secure encrypted communication protocol we had established years ago for severe corporate emergencies. My secure tablet chimed inside my safe house. I answered the encrypted video call instantly, seeing Elena's terrified, pale face on the screen. She had believed the official hospital reports. She thought she was calling to speak with my doctors or my legal representatives. When she saw me sitting at a glass desk, looking perfectly healthy and incredibly focused, she audibly gasped. I quickly and calmly explained the reality of the situation. I told her about the thallium poisoning the frozen accounts and the elaborate murder plot orchestrated by the man she had just spoken to. Elena did not break down in tears. She did not panic. Her shock instantly crystallized into pure, unadulterated rage. She was a fiercely protective woman, and she was immediately ready to go to absolute war for her boss. She placed the fraudulent contracts on her high-resolution scanner and transmitted the digital copies directly to my secure server. Agent Davis was sitting across from me at the safe house. We pulled up the documents on the large monitor and reviewed Dion's handiwork. It was a masterpiece of breathtaking corporate fraud. The fake power of attorney was specifically designed to bypass every single internal safeguard we had built. The signature was a decent forgery, but the legal phrasing was sloppy, reeking of Dion's failed law school education. He had included clauses that explicitly directed the $10 million purchase funds into a brand new holding account registered exclusively in his name, completely bypassing the Zenith corporate ledger. It was the ultimate smoking gun. Agent Davis leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Dion was attempting to steal a multi-million-dollar corporation across state lines using fabricated legal instruments. It was a federal crime of monumental proportions. Elena's voice crackled through the encrypted audio feed. She asked if she should immediately shred the documents, call the local police, or have the building security drag Dion out of the lobby when he returned. She wanted to protect the company at all costs. I leaned closer to the microphone, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper. I told her absolutely not. I instructed her to stop nothing. I told her to play her part perfectly, to treat Dion exactly like the conquering hero he believed himself to be. I needed him to feel entirely secure, completely unchallenged, and absolutely victorious. I told Elena to arrange the official signing ceremony in our primary glass-walled boardroom. I instructed her to bring in Zenith official corporate notary public, ensuring the entire process was meticulously documented under standard operating procedures. Dion needed to willingly and enthusiastically step directly into the center of the snare. If we stopped him now, he could simply claim it was a misunderstanding, a draft proposal, or a desperate mistake made under the extreme emotional stress of his wife's impending death. I was not going to leave him a single millimeter of breathing room. I needed the crime to be completely and permanently executed. The following afternoon, I sat in the safe house alongside Agent Davis, watching the live high-definition security feed from the Zenith corporate boardroom. The camera angles were perfectly positioned. We had a crystal-clear view of the massive mahogany table. Elena had prepared the room beautifully, setting out the leather-bound portfolios and the expensive fountain pens. Dion walked into the boardroom precisely on time. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit, his chest puffed out, radiating the obnoxious confidence of a man who had successfully conquered the world. He looked around the room, running his hand along the expensive wood, savoring his perceived victory. Elena stood quietly in the corner, her face a mask of perfect professional neutrality. The corporate notary took his seat, placing his official stamp on the table. Dion sat down at the head of the table, the very seat I had occupied for a decade. He pulled the fraudulent contracts toward him. He did not even bother to read the fine print. His eyes were entirely focused on the signature lines. The notary asked him to confirm his identity and his legal authority to execute the transaction on behalf of Zenith Supply Chain Solutions. Dion smiled a bright, arrogant flash of teeth and confidently presented the forged power of attorney. He lied directly to the notary, stating for the official record that I was incapacitated and had granted him total control. Agent Davis activated the federal recording software, capturing every single word and movement in pristine high-definition video and audio. Dion picked up the heavy fountain pen. He leaned over the documents. We watched in absolute silence as he aggressively signed his name on the dotted line. He signed the asset transfer. He signed the banking authorization. He signed the final bill of sale. He pressed the pen down with such force that I could almost hear the ink sinking into the paper. The notary applied his official state seal, permanently validating the documents. Dion stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and shook the notary hand. He believed he had just walked away with $10 million. He believed he had successfully stolen my empire, murdered his wife, and secured a lavish future for his mistress and his unborn child. He had absolutely no idea that the moment his pen lifted from the heavy parchment, he had crossed the final irreversible line. He had voluntarily committed massive corporate fraud, aggravated forgery, and a multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy on recorded federal surveillance. The invisible dynamite I had systematically placed beneath his feet was now fully armed and wired to the detonator. The final pieces of the puzzle had locked together with a resounding, undeniable click. The corporate trap was completely set, and there was absolutely no escape. With the legal and financial snares perfectly pulled tight around Dion and Malik, my focus shifted entirely to the final, most crucial element of my resurrection. Federal indictments and prison sentences would satisfy the demands of the law, but they would not satisfy me. Putting them behind bars in quiet, sterile courtrooms was simply too clean, too polite for the absolute hell they had put me through. Dion, Malik, and Shirley had built their entire false identities on public perception, community standing, and relentless religious hypocrisy. They thrived on the admiration of their peers. Therefore, their destruction had to be public. It had to be a catastrophic, culturally devastating spectacle that would strip them of their dignity in front of the exact people they spent their lives trying to impress. I needed a grand stage for my ultimate payoff, and Shirley had conveniently provided the absolute and incredibly perfect venue. For months, Shirley had been obnoxiously promoting her upcoming 60th Jubilee and Matriarch banquet. It was not just a simple birthday party, it was an elaborate coronation designed to solidify her status at the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta's most prestigious megachurch. The congregation boasted over 10,000 members, including local politicians, wealthy business owners, and prominent community leaders. Shirley had secured the massive, opulent fellowship hall for her Saturday evening extravaganza. She had been treating the event like a royal wedding, inviting the entire church hierarchy, the elite choir members, and everyone who mattered in her superficial social circle. She intended to use this banquet to officially present Dion and his new pregnant mistress Chloe to the congregation, framing their union as a divine blessing while I supposedly lay rotting in a hospital bed. It was the ultimate stage for a flawlessly executed, highly public, and utterly devastating social massacre. To execute my plan, I needed to understand exactly how a woman who had never held a legitimate job was funding an event of this massive magnitude. I tasked Elias Vance with digging into the financial logistics of the Jubilee. Within 2 hours, Elias forwarded a new highly encrypted folder to my tablet. The contents were simultaneously infuriating and entirely expected. Shirley was not using a single dime of her own money. She had stolen a stack of my black high-limit corporate credit cards from my home office desk. Because Malik was the chief financial officer of Zenith, he had actively bypassed the internal fraud alerts, silently authorizing his mother massive spending spree under the guise of miscellaneous corporate retreat expenses. They were literally funding their joyful, triumphant celebration of my impending death, using the exact wealth I had built with my own 2 hands and tireless dedication entirely. I opened the itemized billing statements, reading through the grotesque list of extravagant purchases Shirley had made in my name. The sheer gluttony was astounding. She had spent $5,000 on custom gold leaf invitations alone, mailed out to over 400 guests. There was a receipt for a massive 5-tier designer cake imported from a luxury bakery in Buckhead, complete with edible gold frosting. She had ordered massive, intricately carved ice sculptures shaped like doves and crosses to flank the buffet tables. The most sickening expense was a 10-foot custom-designed floral arch made entirely of imported white orchids and red roses, intended to serve as the backdrop for her grand entrance. Shirley was sparing absolutely no expense, treating my corporate credit lines like a bottomless wishing well, blissfully unaware that every single swipe was cementing her status as a documented criminal accomplice without any doubt. The sheer gall of her actions did not break me. It fueled the final stages of my physical and mental rebirth. The rigorous chelation therapy had completely purged the arsenic and thallium from my system. I was officially 100% detoxed. The lingering fatigue, the agonizing joint pain, and the terrifying neurological tremors were entirely gone. My body had fought back from the absolute brink of death and emerged vastly stronger. I spent my final days in the safe house, reclaiming my physical power. I hired a discreet private nutritionist and a physical therapist, bound by strict non-disclosure agreements. I worked out daily, regaining my muscle tone and my sharp, lethal edge. The pale, clammy, dying woman Dayon had left behind was entirely eradicated. I was incredibly healthy, vibrating with a raw, undeniable energy that pulsed through my veins with every single beat of my own strong heart today. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. My skin was flawless, glowing with renewed vitality and deep hydration. My eyes were clear, sharp, and focused entirely on the impending war. I called in a private stylist to handle my hair, instructing her to create a look that was powerful, sleek, and utterly uncompromising. The soft, gentle curls I used to wear for Dayon were replaced with a sharp, geometric style that framed my face like a weapon. For the banquet, I needed an outfit that commanded absolute authority and signaled undeniable danger. I bypassed my usual conservative business attire entirely. Instead, I meticulously selected a sharp, impeccably tailored blood-red designer suit. It fit me like armor, radiating power and dripping with visual dominance. I paired it with razor-sharp stiletto heels that echoed like gunshots against the hardwood floor with absolute perfection. I was no longer Maya the accommodating wife, or Maya the exhausted executive. I was a resurrected entity stepping directly out of the flames in a blood-red suit, ready to burn their entire fraudulent world to ash. With my physical transformation perfectly complete, I turned my attention to the final logistical coordination. The social destruction of my in-laws required absolute precision and the undeniable backing of federal law enforcement. I initiated a secure video conference with Special Agent Davis. He appeared on my monitor, sitting in his federal field office surrounded by the massive stacks of evidence we had meticulously compiled over the past several weeks. Dayon attempted murder, Malik massive wire fraud, and Keisha undeniable charity extortion were all perfectly documented and ready for immediate prosecution. I informed Agent Davis of my plan to crash the Jubilee banquet and execute the final confrontation publicly and completely tonight. Agent Davis was initially hesitant, preferring a quiet, controlled arrest at their respective homes. I firmly rejected that approach. I explained that Shirley Dion and Malik had used the megachurch community as their personal shield for years. They used their religious standing to manipulate people to secure unearned respect and to justify their treacherous behavior. If the FBI simply arrested them in the dead of night, Shirley would spin the narrative. She would play the victim, claiming religious persecution or a massive misunderstanding. She would use her choir pulpit to solicit sympathy and legal defense funds. I needed their exposure to happen exactly where they drew their power, in front of the very congregation they had deceived. I needed the community to witness the absolute truth with their own eyes. I needed the sheer shock and horror to permanently shatter their reputations beyond any hope of actual survival or repair. Agent Davis listened intently, understanding the psychological necessity of my strategy. He recognized that public exposure would prevent the family from controlling the narrative and would instantly neutralize any potential community backlash against the federal investigation. He agreed to coordinate the strike according to my exact timeline. We finalized the operational parameters. Agent Davis and his elite team of heavily armed federal agents would arrive at the megachurch, quietly traveling in unmarked tactical vehicles. They would position themselves at every single exit, securing the perimeter of the massive fellowship hall to prevent anyone from escaping the impending chaos. They would remain completely out of sight, waiting patiently in the shadows just outside the grand oak doors of the banquet room. I would enter the hall entirely alone, walking directly into the lion den to face the people who had actively celebrated my agonizing, painful, brutal deterioration and supposed final death. The operational plan was a masterpiece of strategic timing. I would control the room, deliver the absolute truth, and watch the realization of their total destruction wash over their faces. I would corner Dion, Malik, and Shirley, laying bare their murders, their thefts, and their sickening hypocrisy in front of 400 prominent guests. I told Agent Davis that I would carry a concealed panic button, a tiny transmitter synced directly to his federal communications network. He was not to breach the doors until I pressed that button, delivering the final, unmistakable signal. It was my right to face my would-be murderers first. It was my right to look Dion directly in the eyes and watch his arrogant, entitled world instantly collapse. Agent Davis agreed to hold his men back until the exact second I gave the command, granting me the ultimate authority over the final glorious execution today. The transition from the sterile, quiet environment of the safe house to the overwhelming sensory explosion of the megachurch was jarring. I arrived at the massive, sprawling campus under the cover of complete darkness, bypassing the main parking lots filled with luxury vehicles. I slipped through a heavily draped secondary service corridor that I knew well from catering various corporate events in the past. My blood-red designer suit felt like a suit of armor, perfectly tailored and uncompromising. My stiletto heels made absolutely no sound on the carpeted service hallway as I navigated toward the main fellowship hall. I slipped behind a heavy ceiling-height velvet curtain located directly next to the audio and visual control booth. From this elevated, entirely concealed vantage point, I had a sweeping panoramic view of the entire grand spectacle unfolding below me. The sheer scale of the event was staggering, a grotesque and massive monument entirely built upon my stolen wealth. The church hall was absolutely breathtaking, transformed into a scene of unimaginable opulence. The community elite were present in full force, dressed to the nines in their finest Sunday best on a Saturday evening. I recognized prominent local politicians, wealthy real estate developers, senior megachurch hierarchy members, and highly influential community leaders. They were all mingling, laughing, and sipping sparkling cider from crystal flutes. The room was bathed in the warm, expensive amber glow of massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceilings. Every single detail of the room screamed of unlimited wealth, and I knew exactly which of my stolen corporate credit cards had paid for every last bit of it. My eyes scanned the extravagant decor. The 10-foot custom-designed floral arch dominated the far wall, constructed entirely of pristine white orchids and deep red roses. It was a staggering display of floral excess. Flanking the massive buffet tables were the intricately carved, towering ice sculptures shaped like doves and crosses, slowly weeping frozen water onto the imported silk blend linen tablecloths. In the corner stood the towering 5-tier designer cake imported from a luxury Buckhead bakery, completely covered in edible gold leaf frosting and delicate sugar flowers. Shirley had spared absolutely no expense utilizing the stolen credit cards Malik had authorized to fund a celebration of my impending demise. The sheer, unadulterated gluttony of the event was sickening to witness in person. At the absolute center of the raised stage, commanding the attention of the entire room, sat Shirley. She was not merely occupying a chair, she was proudly perched upon a literal velvet-backed gold-gilded throne. She wore a shimmering, heavily beaded silver gown that caught the stage lights with blinding, ostentatious intensity. A massive, ostentatious diamond corsage rested heavily on her chest. She was physically basking in the adulation of her peers, acting like a reigning monarch receiving her loyal subjects. A steady, uninterrupted stream of well-wishers approached her throne with hushed reverence, bowing their heads and offering lavish compliments. She smiled graciously, soaking up the praise, completely intoxicated by her own manufactured importance and the stolen wealth financing her grand illusion. Malik stood dutifully to his mother right side, wearing a sharply tailored custom tuxedo. He was perfectly playing the role of the devoted, highly successful corporate executive's son. He smiled and shook hands with the wealthy developers in the crowd, utterly and completely oblivious to the fact that his dummy shell corporations were currently funneling millions of stolen dollars directly into my offshore accounts. He truly believed he was the smartest man in the room, standing at the pinnacle of his financial scam. The arrogance radiating from his posture made my grip tighten on the tiny concealed panic button hidden in my pocket. The bright amber lights in the massive hall suddenly dimmed, signaling the beginning of the formal program. A hush instantly fell over the crowd of 400 guests. The string quartet stopped playing and a spotlight illuminated the center of the stage. Dion stepped out from the side wings, walking slowly and deliberately toward the center stage microphone. He looked impeccably groomed in a dark charcoal custom-fitted suit, his hair perfectly lined up. He grasped the microphone stand with both hands, lowering his head for a long, heavily calculated, and incredibly dramatic moment of silence. He let the tension build in the massive room, ensuring every single eye was locked firmly on him. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were glistening with manufactured tears. His performance was sickeningly theatrical, a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. He began to speak, his voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed, agonizing sorrow. He thanked the congregation for gathering to celebrate his wonderful mother, but quickly pivoted the spotlight entirely back onto himself. He spoke of the incredibly heavy, devastating burden he had been carrying for the past several months. He told the captivated, silent audience about how unbelievably hard it had been watching his beautiful, beloved Maya slowly slip away from him. He described in excruciatingly fake detail the agonizing nights he had supposedly spent crying and praying directly by my hospital bed. He painted a flawless, tragic picture of a fiercely devoted, fiercely loving husband forced to watch his entire world crumble into dust. He claimed he had spent every waking moment holding my hand, begging the Lord for a miraculous healing that would never come. The congregation murmured in deep, collective, heartbroken sympathy. I could hear soft gasps, quiet weeping, and whispered prayers emanating from the tables situated nearest to my hiding spot, behind the heavy velvet curtain. Dion reached into his tailored jacket pocket, pulled out a pristine white pocket square, and gently dabbed at the dry corners of his eyes. He played the role of the tragic, grieving widower, perfectly manipulating the emotions of hundreds of people who genuinely believed his sickening lies. Then his tone deliberately shifted. The manufactured sorrow in his voice was smoothly replaced by a brave, highly fabricated, and incredibly pious resilience. He looked out over the crowd, his posture straightening. He told the congregation that God never gives a man a burden too heavy to carry, and that the Lord, in his infinite and mysterious wisdom, had provided a beautiful guiding beacon of light in his darkest, most terrifying hour of absolute despair. He turned his body, slightly extending his hand warmly toward the side of the stage. He called out her name softly, beckoning her forward into the bright spotlight. Chloe walked out onto the stage. She was wearing a demure, flowing pastel pink dress that was specifically tailored to highlight the slight, undeniable swell of her pregnancy. She kept her head slightly bowed, playing the role of the modest, supportive savior. Dayon pulled her close to his side, wrapping his arm protectively around her waist and placing his hand gently over hers. He looked directly out at the sea of eager faces and loudly declared that Chloe had been his absolute, unwavering spiritual rock through this terrifying, tragic ordeal. He claimed her pure heart, her deep religious devotion, and her unwavering faith had pulled him back from the absolute brink of depression and complete despair. The applause from the congregation was warm, validating, and overwhelmingly supportive. They were completely buying the tragic romantic narrative of a grieving, desperate man finding divine comfort and renewed purpose in the arms of a faithful woman. The sheer audacity of the lie was suffocating. I watched from the dark shadows, my heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. They were standing on a church stage, publicly praising a mistress while celebrating the active, ongoing murder of a lawful wife. It was the most profound, disgusting display of public manipulation I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Dayon kissed Chloe gently on the forehead, soaking in the thunderous applause before handing the microphone to his mother. Shirley stood up slowly from her gold-gilded throne. She smoothed the front of her shimmering silver gown and moved to the center stage with the slow, commanding, and absolute authority of a mega-church matriarch. She took the microphone from Dion, closing her eyes tightly and raising her free hand high toward the ceiling in a grand gesture of profound theatrical religious ecstasy. She let the silence stretch for a moment, ensuring absolute command of the room. When Shirley began to speak, she immediately started quoting scripture. Her voice boomed through the massive hall with a practiced, rhythmic, and highly charismatic cadence. She masterfully twisted holy, sacred words to justify pure, unadulterated greed, adultery, and attempted murder. She spoke passionately about the inevitable seasons of life, comparing them to seasons of devastating loss and seasons of bountiful harvest. She looked out at the massive audience, her face glowing with absolute terrifying hypocrisy. She commanded the room with the practiced ease of a seasoned televangelist manipulating the faith of her guests to validate her family's horrific crimes. Shirley boldly and loudly declared that the Lord moves in deeply mysterious ways. She stated with absolute conviction that God is constantly working to close one door in order to open another much brighter, much more beautiful door. She explicitly, though indirectly, framed my agonizing illness and impending death as a divine closure. She presented my brutal murder as a necessary heaven-ordained sacrifice specifically designed to pave the way for her family, ultimate beautiful blessing. The sheer breathtaking evil of her words hung in the air, heavily masked by the cadence of a Sunday sermon. She then turned her attention entirely to Chloe, warmly wrapping her arms around the young pregnant mistress. Shirley looked back at her hundreds of esteemed elite guests and officially introduced Chloe to the congregation. She did not introduce her as the woman who helped destroy a marriage. She introduced her loudly and proudly as the future divinely chosen mother of her precious, highly anticipated grandchild. She held Chloe hand high in the air, presenting her as a trophy, a divine gift bestowed upon their blessed family. The entire fellowship hall instantly erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. 400 members of the community elite rose to their feet, clapping loudly, wiping tears of joy from their eyes, and cheering for the beautiful new couple and the resilient, faithful matriarch. The hypocrisy had reached its absolute dizzying peak. The room was vibrating with the energy of a massive shared delusion. They were enthusiastically applauding an attempted murderer, a massive corporate embezzler, and a manipulative thieving matriarch. I stood completely motionless, behind the heavy velvet curtain, my thumb resting firmly on the raised plastic of the concealed panic button in my pocket. My blood-red suit caught the ambient light from the control booth. I took one final incredibly deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming orchids. The stage was perfectly set. Their lies were completely established. Their reputations were currently resting at the absolute highest possible pinnacle. The fall from this specific height would be completely, utterly, and permanently fatal to their social standing. I locked my eyes onto Dion's smiling, arrogant face, pressed the button to signal Agent Davis, and finally stepped out from the shadows to let the absolute devastation begin. I finally pressed the small black plastic button hidden deep within my suit pocket, sending the silent, highly encrypted emergency transmission directly to Special Agent Davis. The immediate coordinated response was absolutely flawless. I slipped out from behind the heavy velvet curtain of the audio and visual control booth, descending the carpeted rear staircase that led directly to the main foyer. The federal agents had already breached the exterior perimeter, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. They immediately locked down the secondary exits, their dark tactical gear blending perfectly into the shadows of the vestibule. Agent Davis caught my eye, giving a single sharp nod of confirmation. The perimeter was entirely secured. Nobody was leaving this building tonight. I turned my attention to the massive, heavily carved double oak doors that separated the quiet foyer from the booming, hypocritical celebration happening inside the main fellowship hall. The grand, 100-voice gospel choir had just taken their places behind Shirley, their voices rising in a soaring, triumphant crescendo of manufactured praise. I placed both of my hands flat against the cool, polished wood of the massive doors. I took one final grounding breath, centering my energy and embracing the absolute, unadulterated power of this moment. I pushed hard. The heavy oak doors of the banquet hall swung open with a tremendous, violently loud crack that echoed like a rifle shot across the cavernous room. The sheer force of the impact caused the heavy brass handles to slam aggressively against the marble walls of the vestibule. The soaring voices of the massive gospel choir abruptly died in their throats. The triumphant organ music sputtered into a discordant, jarring halt. The sudden suffocating silence that slammed into the massive fellowship hall was heavier than concrete. 400 pairs of eyes ripped their attention away from the opulent, gold-gilded stage and snapped directly toward the back of the room. I stepped over the threshold and began my march down the long, sprawling center aisle. I was not being wheeled in on a gurney. I was not wearing a faded, sterile hospital gown. I was not the pale, fragile, dying woman they had all been enthusiastically mourning just seconds prior. I was the absolute picture of lethal, unbothered, terrifying power. The blood-red designer suit wrapped around me like impenetrable armor, striking a violent contrast against the sea of muted Sunday pastels and dark corporate tuxedos. My hair was styled in a razor-sharp geometric cut that framed my face with merciless precision. My skin was radiant, flawlessly hydrated, and completely purged of the toxic heavy metals Dion had so cowardly fed me. Every single step I took was a highly calculated, deeply intentional strike against their entire fraudulent existence. The sharp metallic click of my stiletto heels against the pristine marble floor echoed rhythmically through the utterly silent cavern. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a ticking clock reaching its final explosive second. It was the sound of an executioner confidently approaching the block. The sea of wealthy, prominent congregation members parted instantly, scrambling to pull their chairs out of my path, as if I were a living, breathing ghost materializing right in front of them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage, watching the devastating, real-time destruction of their meticulously crafted fantasy. The physical reaction of my betrayers was nothing short of exquisite to witness. Dayan was standing right at the edge of the stage, his arms still protectively wrapped around his pregnant mistress. The moment his eyes registered my face, the rich, arrogant color instantly drained from his skin, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of ashen gray. His jaw went completely slack, hanging open in an expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. His knees buckled slightly, his entire body trembling as his mind violently rejected the impossible reality, walking boldly toward him. He looked like a man who had just watched his own executioner rise from the grave. Chloe reacted with pure, unfiltered terror. She violently ripped her hand away from Dion, stumbling backwards so fast she nearly tripped over the edge of the lavish floral arrangements. She raised both of her hands, covering her mouth to muffle a high-pitched, strangled gasp. Her eyes were wide with blind panic, darting frantically between my approaching figure and the exits she suddenly realized were blocked by federal agents. But the most satisfying reaction belonged entirely to Shirley. She was still standing at the absolute center of the stage, frozen directly in front of her opulent throne. The triumphant, pious smile she had been wearing just moments before was entirely eradicated, replaced by a grotesque mask of sheer, paralyzing dread. Her fingers went completely limp. The heavy wireless microphone slipped from her trembling grasp, plummeting downward and striking the hard wooden stage with a violent impact. The collision produced a deafening, high-pitched screech of audio feedback that ripped through the massive speaker system. The agonizing sound pierced the silence, causing hundreds of guests to aggressively cover their ears in physical pain. Shirley did not even flinch at the awful noise. She was entirely immobilized, her eyes bulging out of her head as she stared down at the woman she had spent the last hour burying with her sickeningly sweet, hypocritical scriptures. Malik, standing just a few feet away, looked like he was going to violently vomit. The arrogant, wealthy corporate executive facade shattered instantly, leaving behind a terrified, cornered thief staring directly at the powerful boss he had foolishly tried to rob. The shockwave finally broke over the massive crowd. The congregation erupted into a chaotic, overwhelming frenzy of loud, frantic whispers. The voices layered over one another in a rapid, confused crescendo. People were pointing, gasping, and pulling out their smartphones to record the impossible spectacle. They had just spent an hour listening to a tragic tale of a dying wife and a brave, grieving husband. Now the supposedly dying woman was marching down their center aisle with the undeniable posture of an absolute conquering queen. The sheer confusion and rising panic in the room created an electric, chaotic energy that fueled every single step I took. I reached the front of the stage. The 10-foot custom-designed floral arch of white orchids and red roses towered above me, a monument to their stolen wealth and sickening vanity. I did not pause for even a fraction of a second. I placed my hand on the polished wooden railing and ascended the stairs leading up to the main platform. Dion stumbled backward, desperately trying to put distance between us. His hands raised defensively in front of his chest as if trying to ward off an apparition. Shirley remained paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, totally unable to formulate a single coherent word to save herself. I stepped onto the stage, my red suit demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the massive fellowship hall. I walked directly past Dion, refusing to even acknowledge his pathetic, trembling existence. I walked right past the terrified, cowering mistress, attempting to hide behind a massive ice sculpture. I approached Shirley. She shrank back, her heavily beaded silver gown shimmering under the bright stage lights as she desperately pressed herself against the velvet back of her ridiculous rented throne. I looked down at the heavy wireless microphone resting near the tip of her expensive shoes. With slow, deliberate, and entirely unbothered grace, I bent down and retrieved the microphone from the hard wooden floor. The ambient hum of the audio system crackled softly as I wrapped my fingers tightly around the sleek metal handle. I stood back up, my posture perfectly straight, my shoulders squared with undeniable lethal authority. I turned to face the vast congregation. 400 prominent politicians, wealthy business owners, and elite church members stared back at me in absolute silence. The frantic whispers died instantly. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the large clock mounted on the far back wall. I stood at the absolute center of their holy sanctuary, directly under the massive crystal chandeliers they had purchased with my corporate money. I held the heavy wireless microphone loosely in my right hand. I looked at the vast sea of bewildered faces, then slowly turned my head to look directly at Dion. He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for a miraculous way out that simply did not exist. I looked at Malik, who was physically shaking his entire face, buried deep within his shaking hands. And finally, I looked down at Shirley, the supposed matriarch, who had foolishly tried to build a kingdom on my grave. The trap was now fully sprung. The heavy doors were secured. The federal agents were waiting patiently in the dark shadows. The stage was mine entirely. I raised the microphone slowly to my lips, completely ready to deliver the final execution. "Good evening," I said, my voice echoing through the massive sanctuary. The sound system carried my dangerously calm, icy tone to every corner of the vaulted room. I did not yell. I did not scream. I did not need to raise my voice to command absolute authority. The sheer shock of my physical presence had already paralyzed the entire congregation. "I want to thank you all for coming out tonight to celebrate my life, my legacy, and my supposedly tragic passing. However, I am afraid the reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." A collective gasp ripped through the audience. I kept my eyes locked on the terrified faces of my betrayers. I raised my left hand and pointed a single perfectly manicured finger toward the elevated audio and visual control booth at the back of the fellowship hall. Elena, my fiercely loyal executive assistant, was standing right behind the tinted glass. She had infiltrated the church technical team hours ago. She saw my signal and immediately executed our plan. The massive high-definition church projectors mounted high above the stage roared to life with a blinding, brilliant flash. 2 enormous digital screens dropped down behind Shirley and her arch. The brilliant displays illuminated the terrified faces of the pastoral elite. I turned slightly, gesturing toward the screens with my microphone. Since Dion decided to share such a touching romantic narrative about my tragic illness, I thought it was only fair to present the actual medical facts, I announced with lethal precision. Slide 1 flashed onto the giant screens. It displayed a stark, undeniable digital receipt pulled directly from the deepest corners of the dark web, showcasing a highly illegal, heavily encrypted transaction. What you are looking at, I narrated smoothly, pacing the length of the stage, is a receipt for a lethal, untraceable cocktail of pure arsenic and thallium. Notice the shipping address. It perfectly matches a private postal box rented under a fake name by my loving, devoted husband. Dion violently flinched instinctively, taking another step backward, until his spine slammed hard against a decorative pillar. He meticulously researched tasteless, odorless heavy metals. He calculated the exact lethal dosage required for a woman of my exact body weight. He fed me poison while holding my hand and smiling. The silence in the room transformed from confusion into raw, visceral horror. Prominent community leaders stared at the screen, terrified, their mouths hanging agape as they read the federal documentation. I did not give them a second to process the revelation before giving Elena the cue. Slide 2 snapped onto the massive projectors. It was a complex, highly detailed money laundering flowchart. Of course, murder is rarely committed without a financial motive, I stated coldly, shifting my gaze directly onto Malik. He was visibly vibrating his pristine tuxedo, suddenly looking like a cheap, poorly fitted prison uniform today. My brilliant brother-in-law, Malik, utilized his position as my chief financial officer to construct a vast network of dummy corporations. I explained, gesturing to the staggering numerical figures displayed on the projection screens. He systematically siphoned millions of dollars from Zenith Supply Chain Solutions. He actively chose to rob a thriving, highly successful Black-owned business, a company I built from the ground up, just to fund his family, lavish, grotesque lifestyle and real estate debts. Malik dropped to his knees right there on the stage, burying his sweating face completely in his hands. The congregation began to murmur angrily. These were business owners and professionals who understood the sheer, unforgivable magnitude of corporate theft. I nodded at the booth. Slide 3 illuminated the sanctuary. It displayed 2 images side by side. On the left was Keisha's sickening theatrical GoFundMe campaign, pleading for donations to cover my non-existent medical debt. On the right was her newly minted, highly detailed travel itinerary. My sister-in-law Keisha could not be here tonight, I announced. She is currently attempting to enjoy a lavish VIP vacation down in beautiful Tulum, Mexico. She begged many of you in this very room for charity. I continued, my voice cutting through the rising anger of the crowd. She exploited your genuine sympathy to raise $150,000. She claimed it was a cancer fund. Instead, she used your hard-earned donations to purchase designer luggage, reserve a private oceanfront villa, and charter luxury yacht rentals. Angry shouts erupted from the back tables. People who had generously written massive checks to Keisha's fraudulent campaign were standing up, their faces flushed with absolute fury at the massive deception. I raised my hand, demanding and instantly receiving total silence. But the absolute pinnacle of this family depravity does not involve money or poison, I said softly, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling octave. I stared directly at Shirley, who was gripping the armrests of her gilded throne so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Slide 4 appeared. It was not a document. It was a crisp, high-definition, full-color video pulled directly from the hidden security cameras I had secretly installed inside my own master bedroom. The footage began to play on the massive screens. The video clearly showed Dion and Chloe tangled intimately together in my marital bed, laughing maliciously. The visual alone was enough to make the church elders gasp in sheer disgust. But the audio was the true weapon. Shirley spoke. Her voice echoed through the massive sanctuary speakers, crisp and undeniably clear from off-screen. We all heard her enthusiastically praising the Lord for my agonizing impending death. We heard her rejoicing that God was finally removing me from their path, making room for Chloe and the new baby. We heard her actively blessing the murder of a completely innocent woman. The reaction was catastrophic. The entire congregation erupted into absolute pandemonium. The prominent politicians Shirley had desperately courted immediately stood up and walked away from their tables, distancing themselves from the toxic fallout. The elite choir members behind Shirley shrank away from her as if she were carrying a highly contagious plague. Chloe let out a piercing, terrified shriek, hiding her face entirely in her hands as the sheer weight of her public humiliation crashed down upon her. Dayon looked like a trapped animal, wildly scanning the blocked exits, realizing his entire life was completely over today. I walked slowly across the stage, my red stilettos clicking sharply, until I stood directly in front of Shirley, magnificent, ridiculous golden throne. She stared up at me, her chest heaving tears of absolute panic, ruining her expensive makeup. The untouchable matriarch was completely exposed, stripped of her religious armor, revealed as nothing more than a greedy, murderous hypocrite. I leaned down, bringing my face mere inches from hers. I looked Shirley dead in the eye, my gaze filled with the righteous burning fury of a woman who had clawed her way out of the grave. "You thank the Lord for blessing you with my money, Shirley," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the microphone for every single person in the room to hear. "You praised him for closing my door so you could steal my kingdom. But you forgot one incredibly important thing." I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly between us. "God does not protect murderers and thieves." I stood back up, breaking eye contact with the sobbing, pathetic woman. I reached into my tailored jacket pocket and firmly pressed the small, concealed panic button synced to Agent Davis. The heavy oak doors at the back of the fellowship hall violently burst open. A tactical squad of heavily armed federal agents swarmed into the sanctuary, their dark windbreakers emblazoned with bold yellow lettering. Agent Davis led the charge, marching straight down the center aisle with lethal, uncompromising, and fast purpose. The congregation parted instantly, granting the federal authorities a wide, completely unobstructed path directly to the stage. Dion Adams, Malik Adams, and Shirley Adams. Agent Davis barked, his voice carrying supreme legal authority. "You are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and massive wire fraud." Federal agents rushed the stage aggressively, forcing Dion against the floral arch and snapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Another team hauled Malik up from the floor, securing his arms behind his back. Agent Davis personally approached Shirley, pulling her roughly out of her gilded throne and locking her in irons. They read the Miranda rights loudly over the chaos of the screaming crowd. I stood at the edge of the stage, watching them get dragged away in total disgrace. The corporate trap had snapped perfectly shut. I had successfully reclaimed my life, my wealth, and my absolute power. Dion's weeping face disappeared behind the heavy wooden doors, leaving me standing victorious under the amber chandeliers. The congregation stared at me in awe, completely silent once again. I smoothed the lapel of my blood-red suit, turned my back on the empty golden throne, and gracefully walked off the massive stage. I descended the short set of stairs leading off the platform, the rhythmic click of my heels breaking the deafening silence of the shocked congregation. As I reached the floor, I stopped and looked toward the main entrance. Agent Davis had secured Dion, Malik, and Shirley, but the spectacle was not quite complete. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers, a sharp, echoing sound that cut through the heavy air. That was the final signal. A secondary unit of local police officers flooded into the back of the fellowship hall, dragging a sunburnt, violently sobbing Keisha through the double doors. They had intercepted her directly at the international arrivals terminal the moment her flight from Tulum landed, hauling her straight to the church in handcuffs so she could join her treacherous family. The absolute ruin of the Addams family was now a complete matched set. I watched with profound satisfaction as Keisha was paraded down the center aisle, her designer resort wear wrinkled and her face stained with ruined makeup. She locked eyes with me, letting out a pathetic wail, but I simply turned my gaze away, completely indifferent to her misery. The community elite, the very people this family had spent decades trying to impress and manipulate, openly jeered and turned their backs in disgust as the federal agents aggressively marched the four criminals out of the building. The grand, opulent banquet hall had transformed into a spectacular stage for their ultimate social destruction. Shirley, who had managed to momentarily break free from an agent grip, collapsed heavily into the nearest wooden pew. She was hyperventilating, burying her face in her shimmering silver gown, as the absolute reality of her permanent disgrace washed over her. Her reputation was entirely decimated, her standing ousted from the megachurch community forever. She was no longer a queen. She was a documented, thoroughly disgraced criminal. I shifted my attention to the stage one last time. Chloe was still standing exactly where Dion had abandoned her, completely frozen in terror. The young, arrogant mistress who had eagerly anticipated spending my hard-earned wealth was now left entirely alone. She was publicly humiliated, legally, implicated, completely broke, and utterly abandoned by the man who had promised her the world. She hugged her arms across her chest, weeping uncontrollably as the congregation continued to stare at her with sheer contempt. I did not waste a single word on her. Her punishment would be the pathetic, impoverished reality she now had to face, without my stolen money to support her. I turned and walked purposefully toward the main exit, following the path the federal agents had cleared. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out of the heavy church doors and onto the grand front portico. A line of flashing police cruisers illuminated the massive parking lot with harsh red and blue lights. Dion was being shoved aggressively toward the back of an unmarked federal vehicle. His hands were cuffed tightly behind his back, his custom charcoal suit stained with his own panicked sweat. I walked swiftly down the concrete steps, intercepting him just before the agent forced his head down into the car. I pulled a crisp, folded legal document from the inner pocket of my red blazer. I shoved the thick stack of papers directly against his trembling chest, forcing him to trap them against the car door with his chin. I looked into his terrified, weeping eyes and smiled with lethal, uncompromising victory. "You are officially served," I whispered, my voice colder than ice. "Every single marital asset is frozen, and you are going to prison with absolutely nothing." The agent shoved him inside and slammed the heavy door shut, leaving me standing on the pavement in absolute victorious silence. 6 months later, the toxic ashes of my past were entirely swept away. The criminal trials had been swift and merciless, resulting in heavy, undeniable federal prison sentences for Dion, Malik, Keisha, and Shirley. Their fraudulent world was permanently eradicated, allowing my true rebirth to flourish without constraint. I stood confidently on the expansive glass balcony of my newly acquired massive corporate headquarters. The crisp autumn wind whipped around me, bringing the clean scent of the bustling city below. Zenith Supply Chain Solutions was no longer just a thriving company, it was an absolute titan of the industry. Under my sole, uncompromising leadership, free from the parasite of Malik financial schemes, the logistics firm had exponentially doubled in total market value. We had secured international shipping contracts, expanded our national fleet, and established a dominating, unparalleled presence across the entire eastern seaboard. I had painstakingly scrubbed every single trace of the Addams family from my personal and professional life. The sprawling Beacon Hill house was sold, the toxic memories boxed up and discarded. In its place, I purchased an ultra-modern penthouse overlooking the harbor. But my greatest triumph was fundamentally changing how that wealth operated. I refused to let my success be drained by toxic expectations. Instead of carrying the crushing burden of the so-called black tax, I aggressively redirected my resources toward meaningful empowerment. I officially launched a massive, heavily funded grant foundation specifically designed for young, brilliant Black female entrepreneurs. We provided capital investments, elite business mentorship, and uncompromising legal support to women, building empires from the ground up. I was actively breaking the vicious generational cycle of financial exploitation, ensuring that hardworking women would never sacrifice their dreams to support parasitic demands of toxic relatives. I leaned against the cool glass railing, looking out over the vibrant, sprawling city skyline. The reflection staring back at me was breathtaking. I was incredibly healthy, my body vibrating with vitality and raw power. The heavy metals were gone. The deadly weight of a treacherous marriage was permanently lifted. I had survived a brutal assassination attempt, emerging as an untouchable, unbothered titan. I took a deep, cleansing breath. I was wealthy, fiercely protected, and entirely unapologetic.